Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, step into the world of Aniello Dellacroce, the feared yet deeply respected underboss who embodied the true code of Cosa Nostra. Known for his cold stare and unshakable loyalty, Dellacroce ruled not with noise, but with presence, a man whose silence carried more power than most men's words. As you close your eyes, imagine the dim glow of New York's underworld, where loyalty meant life and betrayal meant the end. Before we begin, share your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where these stories reach. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and forgotten empires, don't forget to subscribe and join our family. And also, like this video, your support truly motivates us to keep bringing you these untold stories. Now, relax and let the quiet power of the night draw you in. Aniello Dellacroce came up in Manhattan at a time when the city pulsed with arrivals, chasing work and space and a little dignity. The neighborhood gave him an education you couldn't find in any school. Who keeps promises, who breaks them, who you can trust at dusk, and who you can't trust at noon. As a boy, he watched people haggle over pennies like they were gold coins, watched men carry themselves with pride even when rent was late. This was the backdrop: a map of tenements, stoops, shops with tin cash drawers, and longshoremen bent with effort. He learned early to keep his voice low, his eyes open, and his temper locked away. Those habits would outlast nearly everything else. By the time he was a young man, the city's unofficial economies were impossible to miss. Bookmakers scribbled bets in coded notebooks. Backroom card games hummed behind laundry steam. Payday lenders knocked at doors when banks wouldn't. The line between the formal and the forbidden was blurry and moving all the time. Dellacroce moved along that line carefully. Law enforcement later described him as an associate of the organization that would become known as the Gambino Family, an outfit that, in those years, evolved from the old waterfront world into a structured network with captains, earners, and a strict code. Investigators linked his circle to illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion schemes that squeezed steady income out of every corner where cash changed hands. No elaborate show, no shouting, just orderly collection, quiet pressure, and the expectation that every agreement would be honored. He watched older men who had survived prohibition, learned the value of patience from people who moved money like a tide. The unwritten law he embraced was simple: speak little, listen always, keep your business off the street. That approach drew the attention of people who valued predictability and results. Anastasia, fierce and feared, ran a powerful wing of the same organization and prized men who didn't talk out of turn. Evidence tying Dellacroce to Anastasia's inner circle comes from surveillance reports and testimony gathered in later years. But on the ground, the connection looked like mentorship. A sober junior partner working for a volatile boss, one man learning how to survive from another who had already carved a path. The jobs were varied. Illegal lotteries, card rooms, and sports betting brought steady cash. Loans at high interest backed by implied threats bound shopkeepers and small-time hustlers to the collection route. On the docks and in the markets, union posts meant the difference between chaos and order and, for the right people, between flat wages and envelopes with extras. Arrests were part of the landscape. Detectives knew faces, knew hangouts, kept little notebooks full of license plates and routines. Dellacroce earned a reputation as a man who would take the ride without complaint, let a lawyer speak for him, and walk out the front door when the charges didn't stick. For years, most didn't. That wasn't luck alone, it was the product of a careful life. He favored low-key dress, short answers, and regular hours. If a police car passed, he didn't stare it down or hurry away. He kept his circle small, and his schedule predictable. When someone broke the rules around him, he didn't make a speech. He made a note, and he did not forget. The early 1950 seconds brought upheaval. Vincent Mangano, the namesake boss of the family, vanished, and Anastasia emerged in command. In the streets, reorganizations changed where envelopes flowed and who sat at which table. Dellacroce, loyal to the old-school way but adaptable, saw his standing rise. He became a captain, according to law enforcement assessments, commanding men who ran gambling, loans, and protection rackets from lower Manhattan to parts of Brooklyn and Queens. The work demanded discipline. There were union disputes to manage, vendors to lean on without attracting headlines, numbers runners to keep punctual, and rival outfits to avoid or outmaneuver. Those who dealt with him learned he preferred agreements to shouting matches, but they also learned that reneging on a promise would be remembered. October 1957 changed the entire city's underworld climate. Anastasia was assassinated in a midtown barbershop, a jarring public event that rippled through every back room from Mulberry Street to the waterfront. Carlo Gambino, measured and business-minded, took control after that shock, and the family's tone shifted again. Dellacroce adapted, as he always did. He was a man shaped by structure, and Gambino valued structure. Over time, according to multiple accounts, Gambino elevated him to underboss. If the boss set the policy and long-term direction, the underboss managed the street-level engine. Dellacroce excelled at that kind of work. He ran meetings that wasted no time, enforced discipline without spectacle, and resolved disputes before they turned into headlines. The storefront that would become famous years later, the Ravenite social club on Mulberry, fit him perfectly. It wasn't fancy. It provided a place to sit, talk, and keep close watch on who came and went. He used that room as a checkpoint, a place where instructions were given softly, and responsibilities were parceled out like rations. From there, his reach extended into card rooms and dice games, into Shylock books full of names, sums, and deadlines, into trucking routes where stolen goods disappeared in transit, into union halls where votes were counted, and contracts negotiated with a tilt. Investigators later said his branch of the organization was the blue-collar side hands, on day to day, everywhere the cash registers rang. That label isn't a boast. It's a description of what he chose to oversee. None of this happened in a vacuum. The late 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds were a time of pressure. After the infamous Appalachian gathering upstate, police agencies at every level focused on the city's clandestine networks. Phones were tapped. Social clubs were photographed at all hours. Grand juries subpoenaed men who'd never before sat under fluorescent lights and sworn to tell the truth. Dellacroce navigated this with a hard calm. He appeared when summoned, invoked his rights, refused to be baited, and went home. His style didn't make him famous. It made him effective. While others chased publicity or bragged into microphones, he held to a routine that looked dull from the outside. Dull kept him out of prison for most of those years. Dull kept the money moving. As underboss, he didn't own every decision. He executed strategy set at the top, but within his sphere, he set the tone. If a bookmaker paid light, he felt it immediately. If a union negotiator stalled, he called a meeting. If a crew member acted reckless, he cut off access and made sure the message reached every ear. Allegations tied to his tenure included extortion of small businesses, skimming from construction projects, control over illegal gambling operations in multiple boroughs, and steady income from loan sharking that grew with every missed due date. Prosecutors would later say that tribute, the polite word used in that world for regular payments, traveled from captains to the underboss in envelopes. Those claims formed part of the record in later cases. They also matched what detectives observed during routine surveillance. Men arriving, staying briefly, leaving lighter than they came. He had no appetite for flamboyance. You didn't see him in newspaper society pages or nightclubs with entertainers. He preferred the same table, the same short walk, the same corner where two streets met and he could look both ways at once. Journalists who met him in hallways outside courtrooms called his stare unsettling and his voice almost inaudible. Associates said he could listen to a man talk for 10 minutes and answer in 10 words. That wasn't a mask. It was his method. He wasn't charismatic in the loud way. He was magnetic in the way a reliable clock is magnetic, because people organized themselves around it. Legal troubles came anyway, as they do for anyone who spends long enough in that line of work. The most significant early conviction that stuck to his record was for income tax evasion in the early 1970 seconds. He served time on that charge, proof that even careful habits can leave a trail when the government follows the numbers instead of the whispers. The sentence didn't end his career, but it did mark him. On release, he returned to familiar rooms with even less tolerance for disorder. If anything, the experience hardened his preference for quiet processes and precise bookkeeping. Investigators would later argue that he changed the way collections were recorded and how cash moved between hands. always seeking fewer risks, fewer witnesses, fewer points of failure. All of this built a particular kind of authority. Younger earners wanted his guidance because he didn't promise miracles. He promised a blueprint: steady work, punctual payment, no unnecessary noise. Among those drawn into his orbit was a tough, ambitious earner from Queens named John Gotti, who learned by watching how the underboss handled men, money, and pressure. Gotti's path would later define the next chapter of the family's story. But the habits he picked up, the insistence on tribute, the fixed-face calm when tempers rose, the attention to who was in the room came in part from Dellacroce's school. When Carlo Gambino died in 1976, a choice had to be made about succession. Gambino designated Paul Castellano, his brother-in-law, as leader. Castellano's style leaned toward legitimate businesses, construction contracts, and labor arrangements. To prevent a split, Castellano kept Dellacroce as underboss, a decision meant to balance two factions. One rooted in white-collar opportunities, the other in street-level rackets. Dellacroce accepted that structure and told his people to do the same. He didn't build a rebellion. He built a routine, even when tensions hummed under the surface. That restraint mattered. It kept the peace for years during a delicate era, and it fit his lifelong pattern. Work within the framework, enforce the rules you can enforce, and let impulsive men discover that impatience often costs more than it pays. By then, his list of alleged rackets, as described in police files and court papers, was long. Illegal casinos tucked into basements and back rooms. Numbers, operations moving thousands of small bets each week. Protection schemes tied to markets, trucking routes, and nightlife. Loan sharking operations that treated desperation as dependable revenue. And labor racketeering that gave his side leverage in negotiations from the docks to construction sites. He kept close to the Mulberry Street base and used trusted intermediaries to carry his decisions outward in widening circles. When someone needed a favor, a job, a loan, a soft landing after a mistake, he measured the request with cold fairness. When someone owed, he expected payment on the date agreed, not a day later. The city changed around him. Skyscrapers rose, neighborhoods gentrified, law enforcement got smarter. Federal statutes grew teeth in the form of racketeering laws that allowed prosecutors to treat related acts, extortion, bribery, illegal gambling, and more as part of a single ongoing enterprise. This put pressure on everyone near the top, Dellacroce included. Agents and prosecutors argued he was part of the command that directed a broad criminal enterprise. He, for his part, played the long game he always had. Minimal talk, maximum routine, no visible panic. He knew what a life like his required calm under scrutiny, and a belief that the structure he upheld would outlast the storm. He was not a man who gave speeches about himself. He let the city whisper its own myths while he tended to the work that came with his rank. He did not invite cameras. He outlasted them. He did not wear his power. He used it sparingly, in small rooms, with sentences that sounded like the end of a conversation, even when they were the beginning. And as the balance between white-collar deals and street collections wobbled under new leadership at the top, he kept his side of the house in order. Men who paid him did not need to love him. They needed to know exactly what to expect from him on Monday, and exactly what would happen if Wednesday came and promises went unmet. The truth about his life is not that he was mysterious, it's that he was consistent. Born into a city where rules lived in back rooms and deals were sealed with a glance. He rose because he never forgot how to carry himself in a crowd. He learned early that the man who speaks least is the one remembered most clearly in the end. When his name began turning up in indictments and newspaper stories in the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds, those who had watched him for decades saw the same expression, a face that gave nothing away, a man who had built a career on steadiness. Allegations piled up, court dates loomed, prosecutors sharpened their cases. He kept walking the same route to the same door on Mulberry, kept the same hours, kept the same collection schedule moving like gears. By the time the pressure reached its peak, he had spent a lifetime guiding money from street corners and card tables into envelopes. From envelopes into hands he trusted, from those hands up through a system as elaborate as any corporate chart. He was the underboss in a world where titles meant responsibility before they meant glamour. The ledger of his life, as drawn by investigators and journalists, included crimes that bent and broke the law in ways both simple and sophisticated. extortion that leaned on fear without showy threats, gambling that outpaced any legal bookmaker's ledger, loans that trapped borrowers, influence that warped union votes, and contract bids. He didn't invent those practices. He refined them into a routine that ran on time. And until the very last season of his life, routine was the thing he believed in most. Night after night, he kept to the same unhurried rhythm, a quiet figure passing brick stoops and dim neon on his way to the Mulberry Street room, where the ashtrays were always half full and the talk was always at a whisper. The storefront door closed behind him with a soft click, and whatever was noisy in the city stayed outside. He didn't rush the first cup of coffee. He listened to the morning recap, the afternoon plans, the small problems that could turn into big ones if ignored. His strength was steadiness. People learned that when he nodded, the subject was settled. When he asked a second question, there was something he didn't like. This was how Aniello Dellacroce ran the blue-collar heart of a powerful outfit in a town that never stopped counting. Bookmakers were the metronome. Their ledgers moved through a network of collectors who knew every block where bets were placed, barbacks who worked late, cab drivers before sunrise, office workers on lunch breaks, retired men who lived for baseball lines and football spreads. Each bet was small enough to blend into the day, but they added up to a flow that could carry a crew if it stayed regular. Under Dellacroce's watch, the crews stayed punctual. He didn't need raised voices to enforce punctuality. He used expectation, which weighs more than threats because it never stops pressing down. The men who ran those routes brought envelopes to Mulberry Street, put them on the table, and left with instructions that were as brief as they were clear. Loans at stiff interest were the second pillar. When a shopkeeper needed quick cash because a delivery truck had broken down, or the rent jumped without warning, there were numbers to call that didn't involve banks. Those loans were designed to be hard to escape. A late payment rolled into a bigger obligation. Month by month, debt became a tool. Prosecutors would later describe how those debts turned into leverage that opened back doors. A piece of a bar's cash flow, a slice of a small cafe's weekend take, a say in which vendor supplied produce or meat. None of it was flashy. It was consistent. And consistency creates habit. In that world, habit paid. In markets and union halls, the same logic applied. The person who controlled hiring lists controlled families' food money. And that control could be used to tilt elections, contracts, and job assignments. Investigators linked his side of the family to influence in the garment center, the docks, trucking routes, and construction zones, where concrete set as fast as deals. The work was often described as racketeering, a broad term for a system that made revenue from pressure and dependency. If a company wanted a smooth path for deliveries, it learned who to call. If a foreman wanted crews that showed up on time, he learned which names to accept on the roster. All of that sat near Dellacroce's desk, in the sense that problems eventually landed there, if they threatened the flow. Leadership above him shifted. Carlo Gambino preferred calm growth, low profile, and dependable returns. Dellacroce fit that style. He became the man who kept the lower rungs moving: gambling, loans, control over routes, discipline in the crews. When Carmine Fatico, a respected captain from Queens, faced legal trouble in the early 1972s, the crew he had built around the Burgeon Hunt and Fish Club needed guidance. John Gotti emerged as the strong voice there, and Dellacroce backed him as acting captain, a practical decision that kept the Queen's engine humming. He knew talent when he saw it, and he understood that nothing ruined a crew faster than uncertainty. With that nod, he forged a bond that would matter more than anyone could see at the time. The city's underworld saw a violent jolt when Emmanuel Manny Gambino, a relative of the boss, was kidnapped in 1972 and later found dead. That crime broke unspoken boundaries and demanded a response. In 1973, James McBratney, accused of involvement in that kidnapping scheme, was killed in a Staten Island lounge. Gotti, still an up-and-comer, took a plea deal tied to that incident years later. Accounts about who precisely approved the retaliation vary in the public record. What is clear is that any such move required clearance from the top, and Dellacroce, as underboss and keeper of the street side, stood close to consequential decisions. The episode shows the way he navigated crises, measured, structured, and aimed at restoring order without spectacle. He didn't make speeches about justice. He made sure his side of the city understood that breaches brought consequences. Courtrooms were familiar by then. Arrests and arraignments were occupational noise. The case that stuck, the one that put him behind a federal fence, was tax evasion in the early 1972. Agents didn't need whispers or street gossip for that kind of charge. They needed numbers. They followed bank deposits, tracked spending that didn't match reported income, and presented ledgers thicker than any rumor. He was convicted and served time. There are no dramatic scenes from those months, only a daily routine different from Mulberry Street, without the freedom of movement he prized. When he walked out, he returned to the same habits with an even tighter focus. If anything, the conviction reinforced his preference for clean lines and careful distance between himself and transactions that could be traced. Gambino's death in 1976 brought a careful handoff of authority. Paul Castellano, who pushed the family toward business fronts, construction schemes, and labor deals, assumed the top position. He kept Dellacroce as underboss to steady the men who thrived in the street trades. That balance worked because Dellacroce made it work. He told his captains to respect the new structure and to keep the wheels turning. His method did not involve public loyalty oaths. It involved showing up on time, keeping payments regular, and resolving arguments before they reached a volume that drew sirens. For a while, that was enough to keep factions from hardening into open feuds. From Ravenite's folding chairs, he monitored gambling parlors tucked behind storefronts, dice games that moved from apartment to apartment, and sports betting operations that expanded with every professional season. He oversaw Shylock books in neighborhoods where cash still ruled, and he kept a hand on trucking routes that could make or break a shop's weekly numbers. Detectives watching the club saw a steady procession of familiar faces. Captains, soldiers, associates, couriers who never stayed long. Notes taken from those stakeouts read like attendance logs. They didn't produce many handcuffs by themselves, but they built the foundation for broader cases, centered on patterns: who visited whom, how often, on which days. He treated the surveillance as another part of the weather. If he couldn't stop the rain, he could carry an umbrella. The harm these operations did to neighborhoods was not theoretical. A bookmaker who turned ugly when a bettor missed too many payments could wreck a family. A loan that doubled and doubled again could break a shop that fed a block. A union manipulated to favor certain companies over others, distorted competition, raised prices, and punished honest contractors who refused to play along. Dellacroce didn't wave a flag over these results. He managed a system that produced them. In his world, reliability outweighed sentiment. He expected that the machine would run, and he ensured it did. During the late 1972, federal agencies began stitching together new tools. Racketeering statutes allowed prosecutors to treat a string of acts, gambling, extortion, bribery, fraud, as parts of a single ongoing enterprise directed by a hierarchy. That sharpened focus hit every major figure in New York's clandestine network. Castellano faced scrutiny for construction and union schemes. Dellacroce drew attention for the street churn he supervised. The government listened, watched, subpoenaed, and learned to think about these groups the way the groups thought about themselves, as layered organizations with lines of authority and streams of cash feeding upward. At the same time, friction simmered inside the house. Castellano distrusted narcotics because drug cases drew heavy sentences and intense investigative resources. The rule against dealing was long-standing, but in the Queen's crew that Dellacroce had encouraged, some men ignored it. Angelo Ruggiero, a close Gotti ally, came under intense FBI scrutiny. Agents planted microphones in Ruggiero's home, captured hours of talk, and gathered proof of drug trafficking. When transcripts surfaced, Castellano demanded to read them, claiming the right to judge whether rules had been broken and whether punishments should fall. Dellacroce found himself in the middle. He had always favored unity over public punishments, caution over reckless discipline. According to accounts from that era, he resisted turning over the tapes, partly to protect the men who looked to him, partly to prevent a chain reaction that could split the family. That decision bought time, not peace. Stories from associates paint a clear picture of his leadership style during that tense stretch. Meetings were brief, pointed, and usually ended with a reminder to avoid careless talk. He urged captains to keep their men busy with steady earners, card games that moved at a brisk pace, sports books that paid on Mondays, loans that were large enough to matter but small enough to hide in a drawer. He talked often about routine because routine preserved safety. He trusted in old rules, no public arguments, no wasted nights, no intoxication that could loosen a tongue. In an age of microphones tucked into wall outlets and cameras hidden in cars, his advice was not romantic. It was survival. Cargo theft at the airport had been a profitable channel for Queen's crews since the 1,960 seconds, with entire pallets of electronics or clothing disappearing between warehouse and showroom. While those operations belonged to specific captains, oversight from the underboss ensured disputes didn't erupt into feuds. If a crew took a load beyond its allotment, a sit-down followed, and revenues were adjusted to avoid cycles of retaliation. In the construction world, concrete pours on large projects were often steered to favored firms, a practice that investigators would describe later as the concrete club. While Castellano sat closer to those negotiations, Dellacroce's position gave him a say. When his captains touched any part of that chain moving materials, securing sites, keeping picket lines in check, the effectiveness of the family depended on those overlapping spheres working without sparks. He gave nothing to reporters. On the rare occasions when a journalist caught him outside a courthouse and asked a question, he either said nothing or offered a sentence that revealed less than silence. Court records, though, show steady legal pressure during these years. He fought tax matters where the government tried to reconstruct income from spending patterns. He answered to charges related to illegal gambling and extortion in various districts. Some counts were dismissed, some cases faded. One or two moved forward, and then stalled when witnesses recanted. Defense lawyers argued that the government's picture relied on rumor and guilt by association. Prosecutors insisted they were drawing lines between verifiable acts. Inside the Mulberry Street room, the talk rarely strayed beyond schedules, payments, and disputes that needed refereeing. Younger men often wanted to leap steps, to chase big scores that would move them up faster. He slowed them down. He'd spent decades watching impatient schemes bring sirens. He knew that the crews who survived longest kept to dependable revenue. Numbers betting among factory workers on payday, clubhouse card tables, weekly loan payments, truck routes secured through union allies, and protection agreements that kept bars free of smashed glass and surprise inspections. Even his critics admitted that he possessed a rare ability to make men feel the weight of order without ever raising his voice. Friction with law enforcement sharpened again in the early 1980 seconds. By then, agents and prosecutors had learned to build cases with tapes and ledgers, not just informants. They traced money from bookmakers to collectors, to middlemen, then higher. They mapped union locals in the garment center and on construction sites, noting where votes fell and who benefited. Dellacroce was indicted on racketeering charges that alleged he helped direct a criminal enterprise involved in gambling, loan sharking, and extortion, among other offenses. He pleaded not guilty. Pre-trial motions dragged on. His legal team attacked the structure of the case, argued that the government had lumped together separate acts as if they were a single conspiracy, and challenged the reliability of surveillance. While that fight was underway, he kept working, as if the only way to beat pressure was to keep routines intact. The strain inside the family worsened. Castellano's focus on contracts and business fronts alienated crews who felt ignored or disrespected. The drug rule dispute deepened old divisions. Through all of it, Dellacroce tried to keep men from choosing sides in the open. He called meetings, urged patience, and reminded everyone that hot blood brings indictments. He had always believed that personal pride is a liability in their world. Pride makes a man talk too loud. Pride shows its face to the wrong camera. Pride invites results that can't be undone. Age and illness began to make themselves known. People close to him noticed he tired sooner. He missed a meeting here and there, something he would never have done in earlier years. But even as his stamina faded, his habits did not. He arrived at Ravenite as often as he could. He took reports, made assignments, and sent men on their way with the same sparse instructions. Outside, surveillance vans hummed. Inside, coffee cooled in ceramic cups as orders went out like quiet drumbeats. His legacy by that point was not an invention of the press. It lived in the men who copied his schedule, his economy of words, his reliance on the calendar. He had shown how to run the blue-collar gears of a large organization through dozens of arrests, through leadership changes, through new laws and new tactics from the other side. He had done it by making himself the least dramatic person in every room, even as he sat near the top of a chart that investigators drew with arrows and boxes. The street knew what to expect from him, which in the end may be the highest form of authority any man can have in a life built on unwritten rules. What he built and maintained carried a cost paid by countless others. Families crushed by gambling debt. Business owners who handed over a slice of their work to keep doors from being kicked in. Workers whose union choices were narrowed by pressure. He didn't offer apologies for that. He moved money through a system that rewarded control and punished weakness. He believed in order more than he believed in anything else. As the early 1980 seconds tilted toward a showdown that many claimed to see coming, he focused on his corner of the city, the way he had always done, one appointment at a time, one envelope at a time, one reminder at a time, to speak softly and keep your eyes open. Through the early 1980 seconds, his days followed lines he had drawn long before. A slow approach to the club on Mulberry, a brief stop at the door to read the sidewalk, a seat that gave him a view of the front window and the back hall, and a rotation of short meetings that kept money and instructions moving. He liked order more than talk. He asked one question at a time, waited for exact answers, and waved men out when he was satisfied. No one mistook quiet for softness. With him, quiet meant the subject was closed and the schedule would be met. Gambling was still the heartbeat, but the machinery had grown more polished. Sports seasons brought steady volume, and point spreads were updated with the speed of rumor. Sheets traveled in jackets and glove compartments. Numbers phoned in from pay booths that were never used twice in a row. Payouts made on fixed days that did not change even when blizzards slowed the city to a crawl. He insisted on punctuality. Bookmakers who came late felt the chill in the room. Repeat lateness meant losing a route, which in that world was a livelihood. He ran layoff lines carefully, balancing risk across the network so a weekend of underdogs covering the spread would not sink anyone. Runners carried envelopes with exact totals, no scribbles, no loose bills. If a better became too deep, the debt moved from simple wagering to something heavier. A payment calendar appeared, interest climbed, and the borrower's choices narrowed. Prosecutors would later describe this as a system designed to keep people on a hook, a revenue stream that fed upward as dependably as rent. He did not argue with that description. He kept the stream even. Labor influence remained the other pillar. In the garment center, trucks didn't roll unless certain names cleared the path. On the docks, hiring lists and overtime assignments determined who bought groceries that week. In the building trades, concrete, steel, and deliveries were coordinated at levels far above foremen. A well-placed phone call could solve a delay or create one. Investigators who mapped these relationships talked about labor peace, sold at a premium. He didn't present it as a slogan. He treated it as a product. Pay for predictability, get your job done on time. Cases on the waterfront in the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds showed how intertwined these worlds were. A prominent union figure close to the family faced trial for bribery and tax offenses and went to prison, a public reminder that envelopes and influence came with risk. Each conviction cut one line and forced a shift in others. He reacted by tightening the lines he still held, keeping meetings smaller, using couriers who didn't ask questions, and testing loyalty with small tasks before larger ones ever appeared. Airport cargo remained tempting. Pallets of electronics and designer goods could vanish without a sound if warehouse men and drivers looked the other way. Those thefts didn't run through one desk. They ran through multiple crews and rival families. His role, as underboss with authority over blue-collar operations, was to keep fights from starting when two sets of hands reached for the same freight. Sit-downs settled which crew had the right claim, which company would eat the loss, and how the proceeds would be divided. The point was to prevent noise that invited attention from agents who already had the airport under bright lights. Enforcement in his realm did not rely on spectacle. A bar that balked at protection payments might find deliveries delayed or inspections arriving like clockwork. A borrower who stalled could lose access to union jobs or see a relative's work assignment evaporate. The message traveled without shouting. From the outside, these outcomes looked like bad luck. Inside the network, everyone knew the calendar that had been missed and the reminder that had been ignored. Fear existed, but it was not displayed. It lived in the knowledge that order would be restored. Federal pressure took a new shape when prosecutors leaned on racketeering statutes that allowed them to treat many small acts as a single ongoing enterprise. Agents mapped social clubs and coffee shops, wired telephones, and watched doorways from vans that never moved during certain hours. They weren't hunting one bet or one loan. They were arguing that a structured hierarchy directed it all. In that framework, his title mattered. Underboss meant coordination, and coordination translated into responsibility. He prepared to fight that logic in court by making it harder to draw clean lines between him and street transactions. Inside the family, fault lines widened. Paul Castellano preferred contract tables to corner tables. He wanted construction deals, wholesale supply arrangements, and labor committees tied tightly to his interests. The men who worked cards, sports, loans, airport scores, and bar routes felt ignored and sometimes disrespected. Aniello Dellacroce kept them in the fold by telling them what he had always told them. Keep earnings regular, keep tempers low, keep your names out of conversations that travel. For a long stretch, his word held the center. One dispute grew into a crisis when agents planted microphones in a Queens house where Angelo Ruggiero, a loud earner from the Virgin crew, talked without restraint. Tapes captured conversations about heroin. The old rule against drug dealing had teeth because drug cases carried heavy penalties and drew the nation's attention. Castellano demanded the transcripts. He wanted to know if men under his flag had crossed a line he warned them not to cross. Dellacroce pressed pause, partly to shield the men who looked to him, partly to prevent an internal punishment that could erupt into a feud. That delay helped no one in the long run. It kept a lid on a boiling pot. When Gotti and Ruggiero were indicted on narcotics charges, the family's edges frayed further. Trials and appeals would drag on for years, but the immediate effect was simple. Surveillance and arrests hit Queens like a storm, and every conversation became dangerous. Dellacroce spoke more about caution. He urged shorter talks, more breathing room between people and phones, and fewer gatherings that could be captured in a single sweep. He had always believed that their worst enemy wasn't a rival crew. It was carelessness. Meanwhile, the government's sights lifted higher. A microphone in Castellano's Staten Island home recorded discussions about business arrangements and authority. Agents stitched those tapes together with witness testimony, surveillance logs, and financial records to argue that the city's leading figures directed a joint venture that reached into construction, concrete, windows contracts, labor locals, gambling, and extortion. In early 1985, a sweeping indictment named bosses and senior figures, including Castellano and Dellacroce, in a racketeering case built around the idea of a commission that set policy and settled disputes across families. He pleaded not guilty. His lawyers attacked the structure of the case, said prosecutors had combined separate people and separate acts to create one picture that was more dramatic than fair. They argued that a man who sits in a social club receiving visitors is not automatically responsible for everything those visitors do. They challenged tapes, claimed context had been cut, and tried to push trial dates back. Health problems added another layer. The court eventually severed his case from the main group because he was too sick to sit through long proceedings. The charges remained. The fight would outlive him. Illness didn't erase habit. Even as his stamina dipped, he stuck to the old pattern. He showed up at Mulberry when he could, kept the front room calm, and turned long problems into short ones. He chose his words carefully, partly out of nature, partly because he knew microphones could be anywhere. He took walks after meetings, choosing routes with open air over cramped booths, making sure whatever had to be said was said where white noise from traffic would blur syllables into nothing. The habit of survival was as much muscle memory as strategy. He still coached young earners away from vanity. Flash drew cameras, and cameras drew indictments. He reminded them that a reputation worth having didn't require noise. Men talked in that world, but the ones who prospered said little. He pointed to simple fundamentals. Collect on time. Kick up on time. Don't borrow from tomorrow to make today look good. He disliked clever schemes that depended on luck and other people's mistakes. He had lived long enough to know that patience fed more families than any streak of hot dice ever could. From the outside, his control over the blue-collar side could look like a relic. The city was building new towers, chasing big contracts, reshaping whole neighborhoods with cranes and concrete. Yet those towers still needed deliveries, those contracts still depended on union votes, and the nightlife at the base of those towers still mixed cash with favors. His steady hand kept those loops running even when headlines focused on larger corporate games. He preferred the unglamorous end because it was resilient. When one scheme collapsed, card tables and betting lines still turned. He carried a ledger in his head. It tracked obligations, promises, and the small marks that reveal character. If a captain helped a weaker crew through a lean month, that was noted. If a man lied to his face about a figure that could be checked in an hour, that was noted too. He rewarded reliability with better routes and more trust. He punished lazy deceit by cutting access. No speeches, no public shaming, only consequences that everyone understood because they felt them in their pockets. Press attention grew as the commission case moved forward against others. Cameras waited outside the Ravenite and outside courthouses. Reporters tried to catch him between the curb and the doorway. He kept his head down and let lawyers do the talking. News columns labeled him a throwback. A man who kept old rules in a city that had turned those rules into television shows and paperbacks. He did not correct the label. He wasn't interested in public relations. He was interested in getting through the week with the calendar intact. Even in illness, his presence anchored the faction that valued street work, gambling, loans, collections, small businesses that paid for smooth days and quiet nights. Gotti and his circle still looked to him for cues. He didn't encourage rebellion. He discouraged chaos. He told men to keep discipline, to wait for the courts to settle what the streets could not without breaking into pieces. His advice was not always taken, but he did not change it. He believed that impulses cost more than patience every time. The harm done by the system he upheld remained visible. Borrowers went under. Independent contractors lost bids or caved to demands because they feared delays they couldn't afford. Gamblers hid losses from families until the hiding failed. He didn't claim to be in the mercy trade. He ran a structured enterprise that relied on pressure and predictability. Victims experienced that pressure in lost wages, higher prices, and constant worry. Law enforcement tried to quantify the damage in reports and indictments. Communities lived it day by day. He never pretended to be brilliant in a flashy way. He was consistent in a way that made him dangerous to those who opposed him and reassuring to those who needed a steady compass. His reputation as a man of his word, harsh, exacting but predictable, was currency. It bought obedience. It bought silence. It bought time during storms that would have toppled a leader who needed applause to function. He led the way a long, unbroken drumbeat leads a marching line. You don't notice it until it stops. The last stretch of his life tightened into a small orbit. Home, doctor, Mulberry Street, court, and back again. He trimmed his days to essential meetings, delegated more, and relied on a circle that had spent years learning how he liked things done. Rooms quieted when he entered, not because of ceremony, but because everyone knew that questions would be asked and deadlines set. He didn't waste strength. He put it where it could still shape outcomes. Agents watching the club saw fewer late-night sessions and more afternoon check-ins. The flow didn't stop. It thinned and adjusted. Captains took more responsibility for disputes that once would have reached his chair. He remained the final word on most matters that crossed blue-collar edges: who collected from which bookmaker, how to handle a borrower who missed by a week, which foreman needed a gentle nudge instead of a hard one. He still believed every problem looked smaller when you put it on a calendar and treated it like a bill. Across town, the case against the commission advanced, and with it a sense that the walls were closing. The old world where a man could sit in a storefront and preside over a busy corner had given way to a world of charts on prosecutors' walls. Yet he didn't change his face. He didn't try to reinvent himself as a public figure or run for cover behind noisy denials. He stayed what he had been since he first took a chair in a back room, a manager of roots, of men, of numbers, disciplined to the end by the belief that steadiness survives what swagger cannot. He knew time was running out, not just for him, but for the arrangement that had allowed quiet men to run large pieces of the city from small rooms. New laws, new technology, and new ambition on both sides made the coming years unpredictable. Even so, he walked the same short path to the door on Mulberry, sat in the same seat, and did the work left to do. Routine had carried him this far. He trusted it to carry him a few steps more, even as the street outside shifted under his feet. By the middle of 1000, 985. The loop of his days narrowed. He still preferred the same short walk and the same chair near the front, but he paused more often on the sidewalk before going in, scanning faces without turning his head. Age and illness were the only adversaries he would acknowledge. Even so, he kept the room steady. He accepted updates, made assignments, and sent men on their way with a nod that meant the matter was settled. The rhythm he had imposed on the block did not vanish just because his voice was quieter. The federal case that aimed at the city's top-tier gathered force. Prosecutors used racketeering statutes to argue that multiple leaders coordinated a wide enterprise, a framework that bundled gambling, extortion, labor influence, and corruption into one story of control. Tapes from townhouses, social clubs, and offices were threaded together with surveillance notes and testimony. Names that usually appeared one at a time in court filings appeared side by side. In that picture, he was placed near the center, not for showmanship, but for management. He pleaded not guilty. His lawyers pushed for delays and attacked the idea that every envelope and every call belonged to a single plan. His health complicated the calendar. Judges separated his case from the larger group because he could not sit through long sessions. Severed or not, the charge still hung over him. Inside his circle, he stayed focused on the work. He had built the blue-collar core by insisting on timetables and systems, and he wasn't about to let legal pressure loosen screws. Sports gambling followed the seasons. Card rooms stayed busy on fixed nights. Collection routes did not miss a turn. Crews managing loans did their arithmetic without emotion. He kept unions in balance where he could, smoothing disputes on docks, trucking lines, and in the garment district, so that money moved with minimal friction. None of that required speeches. It required presence, and he gave as much of it as his strength allowed. The rift between the contract-minded boss and the street earners did not close. Castellano wanted quiet money from business arrangements, labor deals, and supply chains. The men under Dellacroce who handled bets, loans, and collections wanted their work respected and their voice heard. The drug rule dispute made everything worse. Tapes of reckless talk by a Queen's captain drew federal indictments. Castellano demanded the material so he could rule on punishment. Dellacroce stalled, trying to preserve unity and prevent cascading reprisals. To the outside world, it might have looked like a technical argument over evidence. Inside the family, it was a test of loyalty and judgment. He chose delay because he believed delay could save the house. It bought weeks, not peace. He knew the harm his side of the street could cause, and he did not flinch from it. Gambling debts tore at households. High-interest loans cornered shopkeepers until they surrendered a share of their work. Pressured unions tilted bids and raised costs for everyone else. These weren't side effects, they were the revenue engine. His method demanded consistency, and consistency wore down resistance. Law enforcement counted victims in reports. Neighborhoods counted them at dinner tables. He measured them in schedules kept, and in the absence of trouble that might have attracted sirens. This was not kindness. It was calculation. Around him, surveillance never stopped. Unmarked vans idled. Cameras clicked. Informants came and went. He acted as if the only thing that mattered was whether envelopes arrived on time and whether arguments were resolved before they turned into street scenes. He kept his hands off telephones when he could, chose short walks after meetings instead of long conversations in busy rooms, and shortened visits. Lawyers handled the public parts. He kept to his craft, the day-to-day of a hard-running organization. Weeks turned into a season. A cough lingered. Weight fell off. Friends urged rest. He ignored most of that advice until he could not. In late autumn, he split his days between doctors and the familiar block. He disliked hospitals. He disliked debates over treatment. He wanted to sit at the small table, hear who had paid and who had not, mark a calendar, and send men out the door. He had been himself too long to change, but the body doesn't listen to habits forever. On the 2nd of December 1985, he died of cancer at home on Staten Island, far from the room on Mulberry that had anchored him for decades. The news ran through the city's unofficial channels before it reached the papers. Agents who had watched him for years noted the time and place with professional detachment and then prepared for the consequences. He left behind a house balanced on a thin edge, a leadership split in 2 directions, and a legal case that would proceed without him. For a man who had loved order, The timing could not have been worse. The wake drew a crowd that knew better than to speak loudly. Detectives and reporters counted arrivals outside a Staten Island funeral home. Captains, longtime friends, and men who owed him decades of instruction stood in line under cold streetlights. They entered, paid respects, and left almost as quickly as they had come. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet and restrained. No spectacle, no stories told for applause. He had never asked for applause. He had asked for punctuality. The absence that mattered most was the man who led the family. Castellano did not appear, a decision remembered as a slight by many who had worked in Dellacroce's orbit. Whether that choice came from caution, fear of arrest at the door, or simple miscalculation, the effect was the same. It confirmed for a restless faction that their corner of the house was being treated like a spare part. The line from that omission to what happened 2 weeks later is part of the city's history. On the 16th of December 1985, Paul Castellano and his driver were shot outside a midtown steakhouse during the early evening rush, a public act that sent shock through law enforcement, business districts, and every social club south of 96th Street. There is no need to dwell on imagery. It was swift and final. Within hours, whispers said John Gotti had moved, backed by men who had long felt ignored, and by a sense that the old balance had broken when Dellacroce's chair fell empty. In a world that preferred decisions made in quiet corners, the new decision was made loud on a crowded sidewalk. It signaled a different era. The takeover shifted the center of gravity back toward the street. Gotti set up shop at the same Mulberry address that had suited his mentor, but the style changed. Cameras started to gather, headlines multiplied. Where Dellacroce had used stillness to make his presence felt, the new order embraced attention. The old advice, say little, give nothing to the lenses, lost ground to a taste for recognizability. The irony was sharp. The room that had been built for discretion became one of the most watched doorways in the country, later outfitted with an FBI microphone that would help end an era. By then, Dellacroce was gone, and the old rules had followed him out the door. His death closed his file in the commission case. Others went to trial, and convictions followed. Press coverage declared a decisive federal victory over a structure that had operated for half a century. Those headlines reflected real work by agents and prosecutors, and they marked a turning point. Yet on smaller blocks far from courtrooms, the daily habits he refined: card games, sports sheets, loan calendars. Local pressure did not evaporate. They adjusted, shifted captains, changed addresses, and tried to duck under the new level of scrutiny. That persistence said as much about his legacy as any indictment did. People closest to him described his manner the same way even years later. Rigid posture, economical sentences, and a stare that made men correct themselves mid-sentence. He preferred dark suits, cut without flourish. He kept a comb in his pocket, a small habit from an earlier time. He didn't smoke in public often. He drank coffee without sugar and left cups half full on tables when meetings ended. The details made no headlines, but they are the kind of details that tell you how a man lived: controlled, predictable, wary of anything that could loosen discipline. Allegations that trailed him across decades formed a long list. Prosecutors linked him to the supervision of illegal gambling rooms, sports betting networks, and numbers games. To loan sharking operations that generated income from compounding interest and fear, to extortion schemes that extracted payments from bars, clubs, and small shops. To labor racketeering on docks, in trucking lines, and in the garment district. To oversight of cargo theft disputes, and to a hand in discipline that sometimes meant authorizing violent enforcement. He was convicted of tax evasion when agents proved what he hadn't declared. On the larger racketeering counts, he fought the government's theory to his last day. Some accusations will always live in the territory between what could be proved in court and what seasoned investigators believed based on patterns and testimony. That is the nature of clandestine work and the records it leaves behind. He didn't talk about family matters with outsiders. He kept his home life private and did what men of his time and neighborhood did: shielded spouses, children, and grandchildren from the conversations that defined his workday. He told younger men that any business that reached a dinner table had already been mishandled. He encouraged modest living, not out of humility, but because flash attracted questions that regular people didn't have to answer. He liked the same neighborhood restaurants for years and tipped without show. He was not warm. He was courteous in a way that masked calculation. The wider world turned him into a character. Novelists drew on his silence to sketch underworld sages. Journalists called him a throwback to an earlier era. Prosecutors painted him as a manager of persistent harm. In a sense, every portrait contained a slice of truth. He was all those things: an organizer of daily rule-breaking, a steward of tradition, a guardian of a faction that prided itself on hard work of a criminal kind, and a man who believed routines could defeat even the largest storm. He never granted interviews that would have let him shape his own public image. He let the city do that work, and the city is never shy. Looking back, it's clear that his greatest influence wasn't a single decision or a single case. It was the culture he transmitted. He taught men to keep schedules, to use patience as a weapon, to avoid unnecessary threats, to press for predictable income rather than gamble on windfalls. He taught that a good reputation in their world meant being the person others could set a watch by. You can argue, rightly, that this culture allowed damage to flourish in quiet ways: families sunk by debt, businesses tilted by pressure, unions distorted by favors. None of that softens the facts. It only clarifies them. He led a life that brought order to wrongdoing and made it last longer than it otherwise might have. What remained for those who came after him was a choice between his restraint and the temptation of attention. Some took the first path and kept to small rooms. Others chose headlines and paid for them. The era that followed his death proved that cameras can do what police work alone sometimes cannot: make pride talk too much, and tie men to acts they might have hidden with the older method. The block where he spent so much time became a stage for a lesson he had tried to teach: say little, let the calendar speak. He was buried in Queens, among names that fill the city's books on organized crime. There were no monuments beyond what is usual for a family plot. No attempt to turn memory into theater. Those who came to stand at that ground remembered him the way he demanded to be remembered: as a man who showed up, set rules, and held to them. Whatever judgments history passes on him, he would have rejected the exercise. He believed in ledgers, not essays. He believed that schedules write a person's story more accurately than speeches ever will. By the time winter settled over the avenues, his absence had reshaped the map of loyalties and opened a door that others rushed through. The quiet he valued did not survive the rush. Yet his imprint lived on in habits, and in the cautionary tales told by those who watched the next generation chase neon. The long view suggests that his way, unsentimental, strict, and methodical, was built for endurance, not applause. It carried him until his body quit, and then it kept working in the minds of men who, for better or worse, learned from him how to move through a city without leaving ripples, until it was too late for anyone to stop them. Winter went on as if the streets didn't know what had just happened, but the habits he left behind kept humming. To understand why they held so firm for so long, you have to go backward, back before courtrooms learned the word racketeering, and before television knew what a social club looked like. The boy who would become Mr. Neil grew up in rooms where every dollar had a job, and every promise had a time attached to it. He watched people settle disputes without phones, learned which grocer would extend credit and which would not, and saw how men carried themselves when fortune ran cold. He didn't speak much, and that made adults notice him. In that neighborhood, listening was a kind of currency. He found older men who understood how to turn the city's constant motion into income. Clerks took bets at newsstands. Bartenders set aside a back table for cards. Runners moved cash from block to block in paper bags that looked like lunch. He did errands at first, small favors that told older eyes whether he could be trusted with bigger ones. The unwritten curriculum had no blackboard. It had tasks that tested judgment. Take an envelope to an address without opening it. Count change in a crowded bar without losing your place. Wait an hour on a bench without fidgeting. He passed those tests because he liked order. He liked knowing where he stood in a chain and what the next step looked like. The 1,942nd city was a machine that never cooled, and the men who claimed the right to guide pieces of it came out of Prohibition's long shadow. They were careful about who they let stand close, and they watched for impatience the way a bricklayer watches for a crack. He attached himself to figures who valued steadiness first in small ways, then larger ones. When Albert Anastasia's presence filled downtown rooms in the 1,952nd, Dellacroce fit the profile of the kind of earner Anastasia trusted: reliable, unflashy, loyal to a fault. Evidence from later surveillance and testimony placed him in Anastasia's orbit, near the center of a section of the family that made money from the old reliables. Numbers, games, card rooms, loan books, and control over union posts that could tilt whole markets. He learned to handle sit-downs, those careful meetings where men brought disputes about debts, territory, or who had the right to work a particular corner. The format rewarded calm. He listened, measured who was bluffing, checked what could be verified, and cut through pride with a schedule. Pay this now, that later. Move your table 2 blocks. Stop chasing that bookmaker. The route belongs to someone else. His rulings stuck because he enforced them without drama. Anyone who ignored an agreement found doors closing where they once opened. In a life where reputation acts as a passport, his said you could bring him a mess and leave with a plan. Apalachen in 1957 changed the weather even for those who weren't there. News of that upstate gathering and the arrest that followed dragged a hidden order into daylight. It told every detective in the state that clubs and cafes weren't just places to drink coffee. It told prosecutors to start drawing charts. He adapted. He shrank meetings, varied routes, and kept conversations short. When Anastasia fell that autumn, the shock ran through every quiet room in Manhattan. Dellacroce did not write eulogies. He went to work under the new boss. Carlo Gambino rewarded him because he understood how to keep machines running. Over time, that translated to command. He became a captain, then the man who managed street work family-wide, the Underboss, with an iron calendar. He built his crew the way a careful carpenter builds a table, no wobbles. He taught men to think in weeks and months instead of in headlines. Gambling stayed central because it set a reliable rhythm. Policy numbers traveled in coin purses and inside jacket pockets. Sports sheets changed every day of the week and came due on Mondays, a discipline he insisted on because lateness ripples outward. Card games moved often to avoid becoming landmarks. He taught collectors to do math cleanly, to report totals exactly, and to never make side deals. Sloppiness, he said, is a tax that you pay forever. Loans at hard interest brought steady money, as long as the people issuing them understood they were not selling good news. They were selling time. He kept rates and penalties predictable. Predictability cultivates dread better than bluster. Borrowers knew the dates and what came next, if the dates were missed. If a person fell behind, the obligation could turn into a grip on a bar's weekend cash or a share in a small store's receipts. These were not accidents. They were the structure of the work. When agents and prosecutors later described the model as extortion and loan sharking, they weren't rewriting it. They were naming it in the language of the court. Labor posts were leverage disguised as routine. A list at a union hall determined who fed their family. Control over that list, over overtime, over which trucking firm got the easy routes, meant control over income streams dressed up as order. He used that leverage to smooth problems that might have grown loud. A strike might end quicker when the right names told it to end. A delivery might arrive when it was supposed to if someone at a peer office put it at the top of the sheet. Companies paid for that certainty. Competitors locked out by those arrangements paid too, in lost bids and higher costs. He didn't dramatize any of this. He treated it like logistics. Through the 1,960 seconds, as the Valakai hearings brought new attention to the existence of a governing council and to the shape of various families, he stayed as gray as wet pavement. Detectives learned his face, but not his voice. Court records show arrests across decades, gambling counts, contempt citations, investigations tied to union influence. He left courthouses more often than he stayed, a pattern that drove prosecutors crazy and burnished a reputation that made colleagues proud. Lawyers called the government's cases assumptions dressed as evidence. Prosecutors countered that the line between him and the street was clear to anyone willing to connect dots. Year after year, he returned to Mulberry Street and worked the dots into a quiet pattern that survived until the early 1,970 seconds, when numbers caught up with him in a way testimony never did. The tax case mattered because it followed a simple line: income earned, income not reported. He went away on that one, did federal time, and came back thinner and more exacting. If he had once allowed minor casual habits, they ended. He reduced chances for paper trails and made sure cash moved hands with fewer witnesses. He kept his circle small and trained it hard. Associates said he became even more particular about punctual payments and about the way collectors spoke to borrowers. "You don't humiliate people," he told them. "You remind them. Dignity in the moment lowers heat later." He mentored by example more than by lecture. Carmine Fatico's crew in Queens, strong earners who ran out of a club that looked like a fisherman's hangout, needed direction when the old captain faced heavy pressure. Dellacroce's nod elevated John Gotti, a move that preserved steady income in that borough and created a bridge between a rising star and the underboss. Gotti learned how to handle sit-downs, how to keep people paying even when they were tired of paying, and how to use quiet to make decisions stick. Those lessons would echo in the years after Dellacroce's chair fell empty. He never loved the shine of big contracts or business deals that required too many people in suits. That was Castellano's taste. Dellacroce respected the returns but gravitated toward the blue-collar side because he trusted it. People bet every week. People borrowed in bad months. Bars bought peace of mind. Trucking routes stayed valuable regardless of who sat in a skyscraper boardroom. He liked the feel of a system that worked the same way in January and July. It let him plan. And planning was the way he answered risk. Hijacking and fencing tied him to airport cargo without tying him to any one score. He didn't run crews that lived on headlines. He ran mediation and revenue sharing so that crews wouldn't blow up over pallets of televisions. He kept tempers from running wild by recognizing claims and smoothing out the division of proceeds. That role is where the title underboss mattered most. Not as a badge, but as the last stop for arguments. He was the person who turned a fight into a calendar entry and then checked that the calendar was observed. He distrusted narcotics for practical reasons. Long sentences, aggressive policing, and public outrage made drugs a poison in more ways than one. He repeated old rules about avoiding that trade, told captains to keep their men away from it, and yet lived long enough to see allies ignore him. When microphones in a Queens house captured loose talk about heroin deals, he found himself choosing between exposing men who were part of his own base or delaying the reckoning in the hope of preserving the larger structure. It chose delay. It fit his nature solve the problem without blowing up the room. That time, delay only deepened fracture. By the early 1982, federal squads specialized in pieces of the world he managed. Teams mapped garment center trucking, traced cash in the construction trades, and tied bookmakers to captains through collectors who thought of themselves as invisible. The commission indictment in 1985 pulled him into a case that argued he helped direct an enterprise that ranged from gambling to extortion to labor racketeering. His not guilty plea led to motions and counter-motions, and then to a severance because illness wouldn't let him sit through the marathon that trial promised to be. The charges didn't vanish. He would have faced them if he'd lived. People often ask, after all the filings and all the stakeouts, what made him different from the others whose names filled those pages? The answer lives in small habits. He did not drink to the point of looseness. He did not cultivate flamboyance. He kept the same few restaurants, tipped well but not loudly, and put distance between home and business. He cultivated loyalty by being the most dependable person in any room. If he said Tuesday, it was Tuesday. If someone failed him, there was no lecture, only gravity, routes reassigned, income redirected, trust withdrawn. That steadiness, turned to criminal ends, made him formidable because it built a world where people feared not chaos but the clock. There is a temptation to give men like him a grand motive. He did not claim one. He believed that a person's job was to keep the machine they were given running at peak efficiency. He happened to choose a machine built on illegal betting, predatory lending, coercion, and the manipulation of labor. The consequences landed on the people least equipped to absorb them. Families behind in rent, small shops clinging to profit, workers who needed overtime to pay for winter heat. Nothing about his method softened those outcomes. His method hid them under routine. Arrest lists tell part of the story. He was picked up over the years on gambling charges, questioned in union corruption probes, hauled before grand juries he refused to satisfy, and served time on the tax case that the government could document line by line. Detectives like to say they knew his license plates by heart. They tailed him to Mulberry Street and to court and back again. Some arrests fizzled when witnesses disappeared or memories blurred under oath. Others never got beyond arraignment. In the end, paper beats rumor, and tax paper beat him. On the rest, he outlasted or outmaneuvered cases until illness ended the contest. Friends and enemies alike called him a throwback. They meant that he carried an older code into a period that rewarded spectacle. He's remembered for a stare that made chatter stop, and for a voice so low, reporters had to lean in just to miss what he wasn't going to say. He cut a figure that looked permanent in a moving city. Dark suit, narrow tie, shoes you could shine with a handkerchief. Even that was a strategy. Detectives notice peacocks. They get bored with plain birds who never change their plumage. He did not nurse grievances about being second when Castellano took the top seat. He knew why the decision had been made and why keeping balance mattered. He shouldered the street so the boss could chase business. That balance held because he forced it to. He told men who might have sought a faster path to power to keep their faces down and their numbers up. The irony that his death ended the balance he had protected would not have pleased him. He would have said the calendar failed, and when the calendar fails, everything else follows. A city never forgets a person who shapes parts of it for half a lifetime. His name still turns up in court transcripts and in the footnotes of books about labor cases and gambling rings. Agents who watched him learned to study behavior instead of headlines. Lawyers who went against him learned to expect no tells and no slip-ups. Younger men who studied under him learned discipline, then chose whether to keep it or abandon it when the era shifted. The lesson moved predictable cash through quiet rooms and watched the streets for trouble the way a sailor watches a sky belongs to him. If you stand today on the block where he sat and listen long enough, you can hear the city erase one set of tracks and lay down another. Storefronts change purpose, owners replace signs, and what was once a room for whispered instructions is now something else. But the story of how that room once worked is still in the air if you know what to listen for. The scrape of a chair, the pause before an answer, the steady count of bills that were always supposed to add up. That was his music, and he conducted it until the last measure he could reach. He was not made of mystery. He was made of repetition, and the belief that repetition could turn wrongdoing into something that felt like weather. People live with weather. They carry umbrellas and plan around storms. He wanted his work to feel like that inevitable, unremarkable, part of the background hum. Federal cases broke that spell by naming the weather and showing how it formed. His response was to stick even closer to the routine. That's the bit of him that survives most strongly in the city's memory. Not a dramatic figure walking into a spotlight, but a man keeping a clock wound in a room where the clock meant everything. What we can say, without romance and without exaggeration, is this. He helped organize and maintain illegal gambling at a scale that touched every borough. He managed loans that trapped borrowers. He oversaw extortion that taxed businesses for calm. He wielded influence in labor that warped fair dealing. He mediated disputes in cargo theft and other rackets. He obstructed nothing openly but refused cooperation when it counted. He caught a tax conviction because the math left no room to hide. Those acts and allegations, taken together, built the reputation that outlived him. They also built the harm that people outside his circle carried home in smaller paychecks and larger fears. He knew that. He proceeded anyway, measuring his success not by applause but by how quietly the machine ran. Years after he was gone, people who had watched him work would try to explain what made him different, and they always returned to the same point. He treated crime like administration. Where others chased spectacle, he built systems. To understand what that means, you have to look at the pieces he arranged and how they fit together, not as episodes but as a calendar that ran for decades with very few missed days. Take the gambling lines. In every borough there were bookies who knew the regulars by first name and habit. The office clerk who liked the afternoon baseball game. The retired longshoreman who never missed a Monday payout. The bartender who took a parlay every Friday before opening. Those wagers weren't just numbers, they were routines, and routines can be organized. Under his hand, collectors moved through neighborhoods like mail carriers. They picked up, they paid out, and they sent totals upward on a schedule that didn't change with the weather. When a week went bad for the house, layoff bets spread the risk across the network so no one collapsed crippled the system. When a bettor outspent his means, the account shifted into a repayment plan with interest that rose if deadlines slipped. Courts would later call this loan sharking and extortion. He called it keeping order. The distinction tells you as much about his worldview as any charge sheet can. He applied the same logic to card rooms and dice games. The locations rotated, the dealers were vetted. The bank was watched by someone who didn't blink. Payouts were fair because fairness drew repeat business, and repeat business turned the lights on and paid everyone in the chain. If a game grew too hot, too many strangers, too much talk, it shut down and reappeared somewhere else with the same chairs, the same cards, the same rules. This wasn't innovation. It was maintenance, and maintenance was his talent. Labor influence fit neatly into that mindset. A hiring list is a lever. Overtime rosters are levers. Which trucking company gets the easy route is a lever. Pull them carefully, and you can stabilize deliveries, end a strike before it wounds a client, or make a contractor rethink a bid. Investigators who mapped this influence in the garment district, on the docks, and in the building trades saw the same pattern: predictability sold as a service. Pay the right people and your shipments move. Your concrete arrives on time. Your site stays free of disruptions. Refuse, and the coincidence of mishaps begins. He didn't invent that exchange. He refined it into a quiet product with few refunds and no invoices. He had arrests, of course. Any man in his line of work did. He was picked up in raids on gambling rooms, called before grand juries that wanted him to tell stories about other people, and named in cases tied to union manipulation. He brushed most of it away over the years with the same technique. Say little, let lawyers argue. Avoid putting anything important on paper. The one case that stuck came from numbers that could be proved. In the early 1970 seconds, he was convicted of income tax evasion. The government didn't need informants for that. Only bank records, spending patterns, and a judge. He served federal time and walked out leaner and sharper, with an even deeper dislike for sloppiness. After that, he tightened distance between himself and the movement of cash, pushed more through intermediaries he trusted, and shortened visible chains. He was not the public face of a family. He was the operator who kept crews from feuding. The airport in Queens was a good example. Cargo thefts drew multiple groups to the same prize. Electronics, luxury goods, anything that could be moved quickly. Without mediation, a missed signal could turn into a fight that bled money and drew attention. He convened sit-downs, listened to claims, and drew clean lines. Which crew had the right to a particular warehouse contact, how proceeds would be divided when two routes overlapped, who owed a makeup payment when a load went sideways. These decisions preserved revenue by preventing chaos. Everyone walked away with less resentment than they'd have felt after a street brawl, and less reason to talk to the wrong person after an arrest. Violence existed in the background, as it always does in that world, but he didn't broadcast it. Enforcement often arrived as economic pressure. A contract delayed, a delivery rescheduled, a job assignment lost. When those pressures failed, punishment could escalate. Prosecutors and agents later tied his tenure to authorizations for assaults and homicides carried out to maintain discipline and deter defiance. The public record on such acts is a mix of testimony, surveillance notes, and cases that ended without verdicts, so the specifics were often disputed. The point is that fear traveled without drama because the worst-case scenario, though rarely spoken aloud, was understood by everyone. He preferred incentives and deadlines. He kept harsher measures in reserve. Inside the family, his influence shaped how men were taught to behave. He urged them to earn steadily instead of chasing flashy scores. He insisted on punctual payments, upward and downward. He drilled the habit of never discussing business on a phone or in a room that might be listening. He valued a neutral expression and a plain wardrobe. Those may sound like small things, but in an environment thick with microphones and long lenses, small things determine who lasts. He lasted because he treated survival as a craft. He never pretended that the harm didn't exist. He simply believed that his job was to regulate a world that would otherwise exist in louder, messier forms. That belief doesn't cancel the damage. It explains the calm with which he administered it. Bars that paid for protection did so because they understood what could happen to their knights if they refused. Borrowers who signed on to steep interest rates did it because legitimate sources had closed their doors. Contractors who accepted a tilted bid process justified it as the price of uninterrupted work. He understood these pressures intimately. He used them methodically. Families paid, often invisibly, in drained savings and strained relationships. Cities paid in higher costs and thinner trust. He continued because routine made those outcomes feel like background conditions. His associations were in education. With Albert Anastasia, he learned speed in decision-making and the value of a tight circle. Under Carlo Gambino, he learned patience and the usefulness of staying out of headlines. As underboss to Paul Castellano, he learned how to balance a white-collar strategy with street realities, even when the two camps distrusted each other. He couldn't bridge every gap. The drug rule crisis in the early 1980s proved that. He argued for restraint and delay, hoping to keep a lid on a situation that could split the house. Delay provided space, but not resolution. In the end, illness carried him from the field before the question could be answered his way. Ravenite, the Mulberry Street clubhouse that became famous, was well suited to him because it offered the right mix of visibility and control. A door, a few chairs, a view of who came and went, and a neighborhood that understood how to see without staring. He used the room sparingly, as a node rather than a showcase. Later, after his death, that same room turned into a stage for the next era, complete with cameras and microphones that yielded federal trials and long sentences. That irony says something about the difference between the world he kept and the one that followed. His rules damped volume. The rules after him invited noise. He carried respect across crews because he kept promises and accepted responsibility. If a captain under his umbrella made a mistake that rippled outward, he absorbed the heat while he fixed the mistake. If a rival crew pushed, he pushed back just enough to restore boundaries without starting a feud. That balance is harder than it looks. It requires a long memory, exact records, and the ability to remove a man from a route without humiliating him in front of his peers. He did that kind of work often. When he had to demote someone, he did it with the same cold politeness he brought to every sit-down, which in that culture is its own kind of mercy. The commission indictment of 1985 pulled together the strands that defined his life in law enforcement's eyes. Prosecutors argued that he helped direct a criminal enterprise engaged in gambling, extortion, bribery, and labor racketeering. They named him alongside bosses from other families, asserting that a board of directors set policy for the city's underworld. He pleaded not guilty and prepared to fight. Health intervened. The court severed his case because he was too sick to endure a marathon trial. Within months he was dead, and his file closed without a verdict on those counts. Others went to trial and were convicted. The legal accounting stopped for him on the day he died, but the portrait in official records remained manager, coordinator, enforcer of a system that generated illegal income at industrial scale. People around him used nicknames that captured their view. Mr. Neal for the formal distance he kept, Father Neal for the counsel he offered without warmth. Reporters described his stare and his silence. Agents who followed him from coffee shop to courthouse called him a throwback because he avoided the trap of celebrity that drew so many of his successors into taped conversations and incriminating boasts. The psychology under that avoidance mattered. He didn't need to feel big. He needed the machine to hum. There were stories, years later, about ceremonies he oversaw and hands he shook to welcome new men into the life. Books and court testimony described rituals in general terms, a pledge of loyalty, a reminder of rules, a warning about the consequences of betrayal. He would have treated such moments as administrative tasks, not theater. His focus wasn't on pageantry but on compliance. If you said yes to the rules, you would be measured by them. If you broke them, the response would be proportionate and predictable, until it didn't need to be. As for money, he believed in steady flows over jackpots. The numbers racket brought small payments from many people. Sports betting brought bigger swings, but evened out, because most gamblers lose over time. Loans brought income that increased with every missed date. Labor influence brought fees dressed as retainers for peace. He layered those streams so that one could cover another in a bad month. He wasn't building palaces. He was keeping the lights on across a network. The fact that those lights illuminated harmful practices didn't change his commitment to efficiency. In his mind, order justified itself. When people ask what he left behind, the answer shows up in two places. It shows up in the men who kept his schedule after him, captains who ran tight books, avoided sloppy talk, and preferred meetings that ended with an assignment rather than a speech. It also shows up in the cautionary arc of the years that followed his death. The faction that rose after him embraced cameras and public swagger. That style brought status and publicity. It also brought microphones into walls, recordings into evidence, and convictions that wiped out whole blocks of the old network. In that contrast lies the clearest measure of his influence. He was the last major figure of his world to hold fast to the belief that anonymity is armor. The people who dealt with him at ground-level bartenders, shopkeepers, truckers, union stewards remembered not a villain with a flourish, but a man who made demands in a quiet voice and expected the calendar to be respected. Some resented him deeply because their payments made it harder to survive. Others, resigned to the arrangement, called him fair within a crooked system because he treated them the same every time. Those aren't endorsements. They're descriptions from people who lived under a pressure that felt routine until it emptied a cash drawer or broke a marriage. His private life stayed private. He didn't parade family in public. He kept home and business in separate compartments because mixing them created vulnerabilities. He ate at a few neighborhood places, tipped with the rhythm of someone who had spent countless hours watching shifts begin and end, and left before anyone could draw a crowd. Photographs from the era show a man who dressed to disappear. Narrow tie, dark suit, expression that gave nothing away. That was not an affectation. It was policy. The last lessons he tried to deliver, even as illness advanced, were simple. Don't let pride pick your battles. Don't make sudden changes to a system that works. Don't turn a private disagreement into a public drama. Those lessons were for men who would face choices he could no longer influence. Some listened, some did not. History recorded the consequences in charging documents, headlines, and long prison terms. If he could have commented, and he never would have, he might have said that time punishes the impatient and rewards those who can carry the same small rock up the same hill, day after day, without singing about it. If you place his life on a map, points light up across decades. Lower Manhattan tenements, a Mulberry Street doorway, courtrooms where the air was always too still, a federal facility with gates that closed with finality, and a funeral home line that stretched into cold night. Between those points runs the through line he valued most. Discipline. He applied it to illegal markets, to men who needed pressure to perform, to himself when lips burned with words he refused to say. Discipline doesn't make a man good, it makes him effective. In his case, it made him one of the central administrators of a harmful economy that reshaped parts of a city without ever filing paperwork at City Hall. When the government finally broke the larger structure he served, it did so using tools that matched his scale: enterprise charges, long surveillance, and financial tracing that ignored excuses. The commission trial after his death sent leaders to prison for long terms. The Ravenite bug that recorded Gotti transformed an address he had kept quiet into a cautionary tale taught in federal training rooms. Those outcomes underlined the edge he walked successfully for years. He knew how close microphones can get. He knew the cost of a sentence spoken to the wrong ear. His life, more than his death, is a study in restraint as a means of control. In the end, any full accounting of him has to include everything on the ledger. He rose inside the Mangano organization, learned under Anastasia, adapted to Gambino's order, balanced Castellano's era, and mentored a future boss. He supervised illegal gambling at scale, directed loans that profited from distress, extracted payments labeled as protection, influenced labor to tilt markets, mediated cargo disputes, and accepted the responsibility that came with being underboss. He refused cooperation with grand juries, fought cases for years, took a conviction when the math beat him, and returned to work upon release. He caused harm measured in family strain, debt, fear, and distorted commerce. He also kept internal wars from erupting for longer than many thought possible by insisting on predictable behavior from men who weren't wired for it. That mixed damage done to strangers and discipline taught to followers explains why his name endures in the city's memory. People don't repeat it for excitement. They repeat it because it stands for a way of doing this kind of business that has largely vanished. If you strip away romantic myths, what remains is a narrow man in a plain suit who believed a world built on wrongs could be sustained by routines. For decades, he proved himself right about that narrow point. The broader judgment belongs to the countless lives altered in the shadow of his schedule, and to the record that shows how order, when applied to wrongdoing, can stretch harm across years with very little noise. He never tried to make himself a legend. He tried to make himself reliable. That choice shaped every corner he touched and helps explain why his imprint survived after his chair sat empty. The city remembers noise. It also remembers routine. He embodied the second kind. If you look closely at the record, You'll see that routine from his first steps in the street to his last week at the mulberry doorway. As a teenager, he ran errands for men who treated the neighborhood like a workshop. They taught him to carry two ideas at once: be loyal to your circle, and be loyal to the calendar. He learned where bets were written, how to move cash without drawing eyes, and how to tell whether a favor was really the first payment on a debt. He wasn't a natural talker. He was a natural observer, and in that world, watching wins more often than bragging. He noticed which habits made older earners last. He copied them until people forgot there had been a time when he didn't have those habits. The first rung was numbers, a lottery that flowed through barbers, bartenders, and corner stores. He moved slips, counted coins, and kept track of who was light on a given week. The second rung was sports betting, livelier and more volatile but still bound to schedules. By the 1,940 seconds and early 1,950 seconds, he had a reputation inside small rooms as somebody who could keep accounts clean and tempers steady. That drew the attention of men who ran larger pieces of the city. Albert Anastasia favored earners who didn't bring police to the door. Law enforcement files and later testimony placed Dellacroce close to Anastasia's orbit, where he learned to settle disputes and push cash upward without needless fuss. When power shifted after Appalachian and after Anastasia's fall, he adjusted quickly. He didn't try to sit at the head of every table. He focused on making sure that card rooms had a bank that could cover a lucky streak and that bookmakers had layoff lines on bad Sundays. He didn't design shiny schemes. He strengthened simple ones. Rules about where a game could set up, what time payouts were due, how to handle a bettor whose debt had grown past a point of return. It was here that his method matured. He treated gambling as a schedule, not a thrill. He treated loans as calendars, not kindness. He treated labor favors as logistics, not drama. That practical streak made him valuable when Carlo Gambino consolidated control. The new boss liked cash that moved quietly, and men who didn't need to be seen. Promotions followed, and with them wider responsibility. As a captain and then underboss, Dellacroce became the person who turned friction into process. Cargo hijacks could spark fights between crews. He turned those fights into sit-downs with splits set on paper. Union pressure could spin into headlines. He made calls that ended strikes before cameras arrived. A bar owner could buck a protection arrangement. Inspections and delays might nudge him back into line without a brick through a window. He didn't make speeches about power. He demonstrated control by keeping problems small. The record shows plenty of court dates. He was arrested in gambling raids, questioned in hearings about labor influence, and subpoenaed by grand juries. He refused to become a witness. He kept his voice low, hired attorneys who liked to kill cases on procedure, and walked out of more courtrooms than he stayed in. The conviction that did stick was the one the government could build with arithmetic. In 1973, he was found guilty of income tax evasion and served time. That episode hardened his already hard habits. When he returned, he increased the distance between himself and the movement of cash, relied on fewer people, and insisted on paperwork that revealed nothing. For a man who already prized discipline, the lesson was simple. Sloppiness has a bill you can't duck. His reach touched many corners, and it is important to keep the picture honest. Investigators and prosecutors across decades tied him to the management of illegal gambling at scale, to loans that charged high interest and tightened when borrowers fell behind, to extortion that extracted regular payments from bars, clubs, and small businesses, to control or influence over hiring lists and deliveries in unions that mattered to the docks, trucking, and the garment center, to mediation of cargo theft disputes, and to authorizations for violent enforcement when lesser pressure failed. Some of those allegations remained allegations. Some were proved in cases against his associates. One tax case landed on him directly. The body of evidence tapes, surveillance notes, cooperators' testimony drew a consistent portrait of a man who ran revenue streams that harmed people who had little room to maneuver. His style as a manager shaped the culture under him. He expected that envelopes would arrive when they were supposed to. He was famous among his men for ending meetings when he had heard enough. He didn't ask for promises. He asked for dates. He knew that crews teeter when they chase headline scores, so he taught captains to value steady bettors over long shots and to keep loan ledgers at levels that wouldn't cause panic if a borrower vanished for a week. He warned against drug dealing because drug cases drew too much heat. He never claimed moral ground for that warning. He claimed survival as the reason. The disaster of the early 1980 seconds, when agents recorded associates discussing heroin, confirmed his caution. He tried to slow the fallout by delaying internal punishment. He hoped to keep the house from cracking in half. Illness and events outpaced him. You can track his influence in the way men behaved around him. They didn't swear in front of him. They didn't monologue. They answered what he asked and left. You can also track his influence in the neighborhoods where his crews worked. Bars stayed open in part because they paid to avoid trouble. Trucks arrived on time because someone had vouched for a route. Gamblers felt safe, placing bets because payouts happened like clockwork. Those are outcomes a city might mistake for ordinary life. They were products of a machine that generated private revenue from public spaces. The cost fell on people who had no vote in those arrangements. The 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds brought pressure that rewarded his type and punished its opposite. Title III wiretap powers allowed agents to plant microphones in clubs, homes, and cars. RICO let prosecutors treat linked acts, gambling, bribery, extortion, as an enterprise with leaders at the top. He responded by shrinking meeting sizes, moving conversations to sidewalks, and letting intermediaries carry more messages. He was one of the few high-ranking figures who made it through that period without turning himself into a soundbite. That talent did not make him invisible, but it made cases against him harder to build than cases against men who loved an audience. He worked closely with captains who mattered in Queens, Brooklyn, and Manhattan. Carmine Fatico's crew was a key example. When Fatico ran into legal trouble, Dellacroce backed John Gotti as acting captain to keep the zone productive. That decision grew into a tight bond. Gotti learned how to conduct sit-downs, how to keep earners in line without shouting, and how to translate threats into schedules. Those lessons did not stop Gotti from choosing a different style later, but they formed the base he built on. Other figures, Joseph Armone, Angelo Ruggiero, and several seasoned earners sat in rooms where Dellacroce's methods set the temperature. Years later, when witnesses talked to the FBI, they described his way as old school, strict, predictable, and not interested in parties. Labor was a constant theme. In the garment center, firms paid for peace that made deliveries run smoothly. Teamsters locals connected to the building trades and trucking routes gave leverage that could move whole projects. Federal cases in that era documented bribes, no-show jobs, and demands for off-the-books payments. Some of those cases named his associates or union partners. He was not always a defendant, but his shadow fell across arrangements that helped his side claim a share of value at ports, warehouses, and job sites. That kind of influence is quieter than a robbery, but it reaches more people and lasts longer. He favored it because it looked like order to outsiders who didn't know where to look for the pressure points. He measured people by small tests. He might send a junior man to collect from a bettor who always paid on time. If the junior came back short or with excuses, the route changed hands. He might ask a captain to resolve a minor quarrel with a rival crew. If the quarrel grew, he would step in and the captain would find his assignments leaner. Rewards came the same way: a bigger sports book to manage, a wider loan ledger, a say in a union matter that could raise a captain's standing. Carrots and sticks, but always delivered without a scene. He avoided public places that invited chance encounters with cameras. He favored the same restaurants where the owners knew to seat him away from windows. He dressed like a clerk. Reporters who saw him at courthouses mistook him for a lawyer's aide until a detective told them to look again. That was by design. He believed that every unusual shirt, every loud tie, every fancy car was a piece of evidence waiting to be photographed and filed. His discipline did not make him gentle. It made him efficient. In cases built after his death, cooperators described how punishments were authorized when needed. The accounts did not include speeches or rage. They included directives meant to restore order. He thought in terms of messages and maintenance. If a borrower lied repeatedly, the remedy escalated. If a shopkeeper balked and spread word that he had balked, the remedy escalated. He used lesser pressures first because they worked and left fewer marks in the record. He kept harsher ones in reserve because he knew fear travels faster than any runner. The commission case that named him in 1985 summed up the government's view. Prosecutors said he helped direct an enterprise that set policy for multiple families, fixed prices on concrete jobs, steered window contracts, manipulated unions, supervised illegal gambling, and collected extortion. They filed charts that placed him alongside figures from other families who were more famous to the public. He pleaded not guilty. The court severed his case because his health failed. He died before a jury could decide. Others went down, and the long sentences handed out after that trial changed the underworld for a generation. His file ended without a verdict on those counts, but the allegations remained part of his record. His death also triggered the turn that put cameras on Mulberry Street and microphones in a ceiling above a club that had once functioned best in anonymity. John Gotti stepped forward, and visibility became part of the job. The tapes that later captured Gotti's voice talking about money, discipline, and violence came from a room that had been useful to Dellacroce precisely because it didn't invite attention. There's a lesson in that reversal. He believed anonymity was armor. The next era learned what happens when armor becomes a spotlight. When people measure his legacy today, they often use two scales at once. On one scale are the injuries his system inflicted, gamblers who slid into debt, families pressed by loans, small businesses forced to share earnings, union members whose votes meant less than the handshake made in a back office. On the other scale is the internal stability he brought to a large, illegal enterprise. Fewer street wars, predictable revenue, a house that made decisions quietly. Those scales don't cancel each other. They sit side by side. He wouldn't have asked anyone to forgive the harms because he didn't seek absolution. He sought efficiency, and he achieved it at a cost paid by others. He rarely traveled far from New York. He was a local power, not an international one. He could have sat in rooms that talked about drugs flowing from overseas, or about schemes that required many layers of bankers. He avoided those rooms on purpose. He kept his eyes on bettors, cash businesses, union halls, and trucks. Sized correctly, crime looks like industry. He sized it correctly and kept it local, which is why his name sits in the footnotes of national drug cases, but dominates the pages of city racketeering files. He is remembered by some as the last administrator of a certain style. Quiet, meticulous, and skeptical of big promises. Books written by former associates and prosecutors quote, "Men who say he defined what a crew should look like and how a captain should behave." He offered counsel that sounded like rules for any factory. Start on time, end on time, finish what you are assigned, keep your mouth shut. The difference is that his factory produced fear-rented calm. He never saw a reason to apologize for that. He saw a reason to keep the machine running. Even small rituals bore his stamp. Holiday money traveled upward in envelopes. He expected it to arrive on the same days every year. Birthdays were noted not with parties but with a nod and occasional small gestures of mercy, like an extension on a payment for a man whose mother had died. Those gestures weren't sentiment. They were policy, meant to keep loyalty from cracking. In the rare cases when he let personal feelings show, it surfaced as a kind of protective regard for men who had proven themselves dependable. He could be patient with honest weakness. He had no patience for deceit. He didn't keep notebooks that later generations could read. He left a trail of behavior, not a diary. That trail is still visible in court documents, surveillance summaries, and the testimonies of people who turned witness to avoid long sentences. Strip those sources of their drama, and you're left with a portrait of a man who believed order turns harm into background noise. He died convinced that the method would outlast him. It did, for a while, until cameras and microphones erased the distance he had spent a lifetime creating between the street and the record. He does not fit a romantic mold. He wasn't a folk hero. He wasn't a philosopher. He was a manager who chose an illegal line of work and made himself very good at it. He helped build and maintain revenue streams that bent rules until the rules broke, and the people who paid for that bending were the ones with the least spare cash and the least spare time. That's the plain truth beneath the stories. He ran a system praised inside rooms for its fairness and feared outside those rooms for its weight. He kept that system humming long enough that a city known for change came to treat it as part of the scenery. That is his real biography, and it is more revealing than any legend. Time went on, buildings changed tenants, and the block where he had spent so many hours folded into ordinary city traffic. Yet the people who knew him, or watched him from across the street, kept turning over the same memories, as if they were coins worn smooth by use. They talked about how he entered a room and stilled it without a gesture. They talked about the way he turned problems into timetables. They remembered that he liked a quiet corner, a cup left half full, and answers that matched numbers, not wishes. If you gather those pieces and lay them end to end, you get the outline of a life that left marks in files and on families, in courtrooms and in small shops, that once set aside an envelope every week because that was the cost of easy days. He was born and raised in New York City, a child of immigrants who made their way in rooms where English and Italian mixed on the same breath. The streets around him taught basics you don't learn in school. How to distinguish a promise from a bluff. How to spot a man who will keep his word from a man who only pretends. How to read a neighborhood's mood from the set of shoulders on a stoop. Money was tight. Pride was not. He learned early that keeping your voice down and your face unreadable could be a kind of shield. In a quarter where everyone knew everyone else's business, he made it a point to give nothing away that a listener could use later. He started with errands and graduated to responsibilities. Numbers play gave him his first sense of how small bets could become a river. Sports wagers added volatility and a different crowd. By the time he was a young man, older figures in the Mangano organization had judged him steady, and steady men were always in demand. Surveillance summaries assembled years later place him close to Albert Anastasia during the 1,950 seconds, a period when the old waterfront ways were being reorganized into something more formal. Captains, soldiers, earners, and rules that attempted to contain the chaos of ambition. He listened more than he spoke. He learned how to collect without spectacle, how to break ties in disputes, and how to keep his side of the work invisible to anyone not already inside the circle. When Anastasia was killed in 1957 and Carlo Gambino rose to the top, he adapted because adaptation is what kept a man in play. Appalachian had tilted law enforcement's attention toward hidden arrangements, and anyone who wanted to stay free needed to shrink his footprint while tightening his grip. He did both. Under Gambino, he rose through the ranks and eventually took on the job of underboss, which in practice meant keeping the street-facing engine aligned, illegal gambling, loans that trapped borrowers, the extraction of payments from bars and clubs, and influence in unions that controlled hiring, overtime, deliveries, and the pace at which a dock or a job site could run. From the outside, these lines of work looked like coincidence when they went well. Inside the system, they were choreographed. Ravenite, the Mulberry Street social club that became shorthand for an era, fit his approach. It was not glamorous. It was a checkpoint. Men came and went quickly, carried instructions, and returned with results. He was rarely emotional. He treated earnings like homework, due on time, done correctly, and not a subject for debate. He preferred the blue-collar parts of the organization because they were durable. There would always be bettors, always be people who needed cash on short notice, always be businesses that would rather pay for calm than roll dice with chance. He trusted those certainties more than any plan that needed public contracts and large boardrooms. He had a rest that came with the territory. Police raided card rooms and sports parlors. He was picked up along with others, arraigned, and usually back on the street quickly. He was summoned before grand juries and declined to help them, invoking rights and letting attorneys do the talking. He was named in investigations about union influence and bribery. Most cases evaporated or stalled. The one that did not was built on math, not gossip. In 1973, he was convicted of income tax evasion. He served a federal sentence and paid a penalty. When he returned, he was the same man sharpened further. Meetings shorter, chains of communication tighter, cash handled with fewer eyes around it. He had already believed that carelessness invites disaster. The conviction turned belief into policy. The work he supervised caused damage that radiated beyond a single block. A bookmaker who pursued a man late on payments moved strain into a kitchen where bills already waited. A loan that ballooned through penalties could cost a clerk his store or a family their savings. A union roster tilted toward allies squeezed honest contractors out of bids and raised prices that customers paid without ever knowing why. He didn't pretend these weren't outcomes. He measured everything by predictability, whether envelopes arrived, whether a schedule was followed, whether a dispute could be settled quietly. He viewed his job as regulation of a market that would exist regardless. That framing doesn't absolve. It clarifies how he justified a system whose benefits ran upward and whose costs landed on people with little room to absorb them. He became a point of balance when Gambino kept him as underboss under Paul Castellano. Castellano preferred white-collar ventures, contracts, supply chains, construction deals that could be shaped through relationships and influence. The street-minded earners who worked sports, cards, loans, and protection respected the underboss who had spent decades in their lanes. He used that respect to keep the house from splitting. He told his men to stay the course, to keep tempers low, to follow rules that had kept them safe. He faced a crisis when agents planted microphones in Queens and recorded reckless talk about heroin. The old prohibition against narcotics was rooted in practical fear, long sentences, intense attention, informants created by pressure. Castellano demanded tapes to judge violations. The underboss resisted, trying to prevent a spiral of punishments that would explode the balance. Delay held the line only briefly. It also hardened grudges that would outlast him. Cargo theft at the airport kept his mediation skills busy. Two crews could claim the same contact inside a warehouse or accuse each other of overreaching on a load. Without a referee, fights flare. The money stops, agents swoop in. He guided sit-downs that turned potential feuds into formulas. This crew takes this percentage. That one takes the remainder. And a side payment covers a favor owed from a previous year. In the construction world, influence over concrete pours and windows contracts created a club of favored companies. He wasn't the architect of those arrangements, but the men who managed the street side of the family had a say when deliveries, trucking, and site logistics touched their sphere. The pattern repeated: turn noise into process, process into revenue. By the early 1980 seconds, the government had built tools equal to the structure he served. Title III wiretaps planted microphones inside walls and cars. RICO stitched many acts: extortion, gambling, bribery, into a single case focused on leadership. Prosecutors mapped clubs, restaurants, and homes. They followed money instead of rumors. They built narratives that climbed from street to command. In March 1985, a sweeping indictment charged leading figures from several families with running a citywide commission that set policy and split profits. That summer, a separate federal case named him and others in racketeering counts, tied to illegal gambling, extortion, and related offenses. He pleaded not guilty. His health failed. The court severed his case from the larger group. Before a jury could weigh the accusations, he died of cancer on the 2nd of December 1985. His wake was quiet. The absence of the family boss at the viewing deepened a sense of slight felt by the men who had worked close to him. 2 weeks later, Paul Castellano was killed on a midtown sidewalk, and a new leader took command. The address on Mulberry Street that had suited his dislike for attention became a magnet for cameras, and in time a listening device would capture the voice of the new boss, speaking freely about money and discipline in that very room. Those recordings helped end an era. The contrast was plain. He had treated silence like a shelter. The men who followed him treated visibility as a weapon and discovered it was also a trap. He left no autobiography. He left patterns in people. Captains who survived the transition without long sentences tended to be the ones who kept his style: sparse speech, punctual payments, aversion to stunts. Cooperators in later trials talked about him without flourish, how he would hold their eyes until they arrived at the truth on their own, how he cut through excuses by asking what date a payment would land, how he assigned responsibility in short sentences that felt final. Reporters who stood in courthouse doorways remembered an expression that never shifted, and an economy of motion that made it seem as if he were trying to reduce the surface area on which the world could grab him. For all the damage he oversaw, and for all the money he pushed across a city he didn't own but treated as a ledger, he kept his private life off stage. He didn't parade family in front of colleagues or the press. He held to a small set of restaurants and a smaller set of friends. He avoided alcohol that loosened tongues. He wore plain suits that could be replaced without comment. He believed that predictability is armor. He was right for a long time, until microphones got small enough and statutes got strong enough to turn predictability into a map for detectives. It's tempting to end by forcing a moral onto a life like his. He wouldn't have bothered. He would have asked only whether a schedule was met. Still, the consequences are not a puzzle. He supervised rackets that extracted earnings from people with little say in the extraction. He kept lines of illegal betting, loans, and pressure running for decades. He wielded influence in unions that warped fair competition. He declined to help courts, served time when numbers beat him, and returned to work when the gate opened. He also taught men not to settle scores in the street, and that teaching prevented blood from washing away revenue in years when rival factions elsewhere tore each other apart. Both sentences can be true at once. He made wrongdoing more efficient and less explosive. The first part counted more to the people who paid his price. Even today, when his name surfaces in a footnote or a documentary, it's usually paired with words like underboss, Ravenite, blue-collar faction, and tax evasion. Those tags are not wrong. They are only fragments. The fuller picture is of a person who treated an illegal economy like a business to be managed, who preferred routine to spectacle, and who left a blueprint that others used until the environment changed. Law enforcement adapted. Technology advanced. The camera and the courtroom swallowed the men who craved attention. His approach concealment through dullness feels antique now, almost quaint. It was not quaint in its time. It was effective and, for many, quietly devastating. The street he favored has moved on. Shops sell different goods. Tourists take photos where he once paused to scan faces. A few people still remember the old storefront, and the men who came and went, with their hats low. If you ask them what made him different, they'll tell you about steadiness. They'll say he was the kind of figure who could make others keep time simply by being present. They will not tell you he was kind. They will tell you he was constant. In a city that changes its skin every season, constancy can feel like virtue. In his case, it was a tool. A biography like his resists a neat ending, because the practices he refined did not end when he did. Illegal betting still exists, though it wears different clothes now that some forms of gambling have become lawful. Loans at painful interest still find desperate borrowers, though some are mediated by screens instead of whispers. Pressure still finds weak points in labor and delivery systems. The difference is that more of it lives in daylight or is contested by stronger safeguards, in part because the cases against his generation taught prosecutors where to look. The lessons cut both ways. His life taught colleagues how to survive with minimal noise. His era taught investigators how to follow patterns without waiting for a confession. In the last months before the illness finished its quiet work, he kept walking the same route to a room where chairs scraped and conversations ended quickly. He knew change was coming. He had watched it gather for years. He chose not to reinvent himself as a performer. He lacked the appetite and saw no advantage in it. That is perhaps the most honest thing you can say about him. He didn't pretend to be other than what he was. A manager of criminal routines, devoted to timetables, skilled at nudging men into obedience, and unmoved by the suffering that bled outward from the order he maintained. He would not have liked any of this retelling, not because it fails to flatter him, but because it lingers. He disliked lingering. He preferred a nod, and the next thing on the list. All right then, one last note before the lights go out. The thread running through his entire story is simple. He believed that regularity could make anything seem ordinary, even harm. He proved it for a long time, until the city and the law learned to name the harm and track its steps. When you look back on his path, don't look for grand speeches or operatic betrayals. Look for the quiet man who made other people measure their days by his schedule, and for the price many paid so that the schedule could keep perfect time. And so ends the story of Aniello Dellacroce, a man whose silence spoke louder than violence, and whose loyalty shaped the very core of an empire built in shadows. He lived and died by the code he swore to protect, a figure of quiet strength in a world that devoured its own. As the echoes of his name fade into the dark corners of history, remember, even in silence, true power endures. Rest easy now, and let the calm of the night wash over you. Until we meet again beneath the hush of another empire, good night.